Alright, is this thing working? It's working. Okay. Alright, so my presentation is on Natalie Babbitt. And she has quite a few books. Some that I'm not going to really talk about is Jack Plank Tells Tales. And it talks about this pirate. He has like a lot of really tall tales. So it's a pretty interesting book. I haven't read it all. I only read like the first 40 pages. This one I haven't read at all, but I wanted to. I'll probably read it before I return it to the library, but it's The Moon Over High Street. Yeah. Natalie Babbitt was born July 28th in Dayton, Ohio. She grew up with a love for reading fairy tales and myths, which is why a lot of her work actually represents that type of genre. She grew up loving art, and she worked with her mother, who actually was an amateur landscape artist. Her mother really supported her in her artistic venture. In her own, where she wrote her own bibliography, she said, her mother always made sure she had supplies, always never running out of paper, which, for her, in the 1930s, 1940s, that was a lot of money to actually have paper. Natalie studied art at Laurel School in Cleveland, and at Smith College she married Samuel Fisher Babbitt. He worked in education. He was an academic administrator. And then they lived in Connecticut, they lived in Tennessee, they lived in Washington, D.C., and they raised their 3 children together. It was Christopher was one of her children, Tom, and Lucy. She grew up, though, mainly wanting to be an illustrator or an artist. Her first work, that got out there, that was published, was when her husband and her actually got together and created a book. She was the illustrator, he was the writer. The book's called The 49th Magician. I have not checked that book out yet. That was published in 1966. Her family's interest in writing books, like her sister wrote a comic book and her husband wrote the book that she illustrated, The 49th Magician, and those really inspired her because she got to watch them go through the struggles of actually writing. And so when they turned in The 49th Magician, the publisher encouraged her to write her own books. So she came out, she responded, she came out with a fantastic book. It is called The Search for Delicious. This book is about a young boy. He's sitting at the Prime Minister's area, I guess, house. And the Prime Minister says, "There will be a civil war," he burst out at last after he was pacing. "Splits, upheavals, and people taking sides. Smiles will be forgotten, and spring will escape notice. Little flowers will push up only to be trodden down, and birds will sing unheeded." From a pile of cushions in a corner of the room, his special assistant, a skinny peasant boy of 12, named Galen, put down the book he had been reading and frowned. "Civil war? But why? What happened?" "It was like this," said the Prime Minister, climbing onto the stool at his desk. "I went down, you see, to show the king how far I've gotten in my dictionary. He was pleased with the first part. He liked affectionate is your dog, annoying is a loose boot in a muddy place, and so on. He smiled at bulky is a bag of boxes. As a matter of fact, there was no trouble with any of the A's, B's, or C's. With any of the A's or B's, and the C's were fine too, especially calamitous is saying no to the king. But then we got to delicious. Delicious is a fried fish, and he said no, I'd have to change that. He doesn't care for fried fish. The general of the armies was standing there, and he said that, as far as he was concerned, delicious as a mug of beer. And the Queen said, no, delicious as Christmas pudding. And then the King said, nonsense, everyone knew the most delicious thing is an apple. And they all began quarreling. Not just the three of them, the whole court. When I left, they were all yelling and shouting and shaking their fists. And the general were glaring at each other. And the Queen was trying to get everyone to listen to the recipe for Christmas pudding. That doesn't sound like a civil war to me, said Galen, turning back to his book with a smile. It only sounds silly. Of course it's silly, said the Prime Minister impatiently. But a lot of serious things start silly. Galen put his book down again and sighed. Why don't you just leave delicious out of the dictionary? I can't do that, said the Prime Minister. If this is going to be a proper dictionary, I can't leave anything out. At that moment, there was a great racket in the courtyard below. Galen ran to the window and looked down. People were pouring out of the castle door to form a noisy ring around two men shoving each other about on the grass. After a moment, one knocked the other flat, shouted, "Plums!" and strode triumphantly back inside, followed by the cheering crowd. The man who had been flattened swayed to his feet and went off muttering. The Prime Minister shook his head sadly. Now here's a pretty kettle of fish, he said. Or apples, said Galen. Galen had lived in the castle ever since he'd been left a tiny baby gurgling in a basket at the main gate. The basket had been carried to the king, who was very annoyed to see its contents. So, just from that small part, you're probably going to realize that this book is about Galen. He's going to go on an adventure to find something delicious. There's a mermaid here, which actually in the prologue, she explains the mermaid's story about how these dwarves, the land was kind of desolate, and these dwarves picked away at a mountain, and a spring formed because he poked a hole right where some water was. And so they hurried and they built like a little house around the spring, and they had a door that had a special flute that would open it, and they all took turns, but eventually it got engulfed in water. And when that happens, of course, a mermaid has to move into that giant lake that just formed around the spring house. And so they gave the mermaid a pretty necklace and a doll that she loved a lot. But the necklace had the flute that opened the door, and so she'd go every morning, she'd flute the door open because the dwarves asked her to watch over this pump house, the spring house. And she'd go down and she'd play with her doll inside the spring house, and then at night she'd come out and blow the flute. The door would lock close again, and she'd go to sleep. One day, a man, because the water had spilled over into a valley and men came in, a man came, and she was scared, so she didn't, speak to him. And he took her necklace because she left it hanging on this sharp rock where it was supposed to hang when she wasn't using it. And he put her on his neck and he walked away. But the problem is that she had swum out in a hurry to meet the man, and she left her doll in the house. And when he blew his little whistle, he didn't hear the sound, but the door slammed shut while she was outside and her doll was in. And so Galen actually helps Artis, the mermaid, get her doll, and he finds the most delicious thing. And I'm not going to spoil it. It's a good book. It's actually her first. It's her first written and illustrated by Natalie Babbitt book. So while she noticed her family struggling to write and get it published, she learned some valuable lessons. She learned that writing takes all of your time and attention, and that it needs passion. And so for her, this seemed to come easy. She got published quite easily, actually. Her husband pretty much introduced her to the publisher, and they encouraged her to keep writing, and she came out with The Search for Delicious. She came out with a book that won a Newbery Honor in 1971. It was Enoch Rise. She wrote and illustrated children's novels since 1966. So if she was born in 32, 66, she was 36 years old, right? Hope I'm doing that correctly. 34. She wrote a total of 19 books. She illustrated 16. 9 of which were authored by someone named Valerie Worth. I have one of my favorite retellings of a Grimm story. It's called Ouch, A Tale from Grimm. It's actually a retelling of The Devil with the Three Golden Hairs. And I'm going to read it because I really like this book. This is a really good book. The artwork is really great. Although this one, I don't think she illustrated this. Yeah, this one was illustrated by Fred Marcelino. Ouch. A Tale from Grimm retold by Natalie Babbitt. Look at that baby. He's got a crown birthmark on his butt. Look at that. Pretty awesome. There was a baby born once with a birthmark shaped like a crown. Can't really explain. No question about it, said the local fortune teller. When he grows up, he's going to marry a princess. This was happy news to a family that was nobody special, but not happy news to the king. Oh, what a bad king. Look, sitting up, grumpy. When he heard about it, he was up all night growling. What? His princess? Who'd just been born herself? He would never let her marry nobody special. Uh-oh, what's that king gonna do? So the king dressed up like someone else and rode out to the village where the family lived. I hear this baby boy of yours is going to marry a princess someday, he said to the mother and father, and they told him that it was true. Well, said the king, you'd better give him to me. I'll raise him properly so he'll know how to act when the time comes. This struck the baby's parents as sensible, giving your baby to a stranger. And anyway, the king gave them gold to seal the bargain. So the king took the baby away in a box. And when he came to the river, he threw the box in the water. Uh-oh. He's throwing that box into the water down below. That takes care of that, he said to himself, and he rode home smiling. That's his big smile. What do you think's going to happen? Did he sink? I don't think so. Look, there's the box. There's that box. There's a man. He's going to get that box. However, the box didn't sink to the bottom. Instead, it floated along for miles, and at last bumped into a mill dam. This is a mill dam. See this? So when this goes around, some gears inside turn this giant stone, and they grind and mill up wheat and rye and barley, and they make flour out of it. Here it was discovered by the miller, who fished it out, and when he and his wife opened it up, there was the baby cooing happily. Pretty happy baby to be in a box floating on a river, right? Well, they were tickled pink because they had no children. They named the baby Marco, just right for such a voyager, and vowed to raise him as their very own. They might have named him Rex, which means king, if they'd known what his future was to be. But of course, they had no way of knowing. They didn't care about his butt birthmark. 7 years went by with Marco, grown up tall and sweet and full of confidence, which he was going to need. For here came the king one day, and right away he noticed Marco. That's a fine boy you've got there, he told the miller. Thank you, sire, said the miller. the fact is we found him in a box on the river 16 years ago and raised him as our very own. Dun, dun, dun. Look at the king's face. Oh, no. Got big old eyes. The king saw the truth at once, but he hid his rage and said, "Tell him to take a message to the queen." And then he wrote a letter. "Get rid of this boy. He's bad luck, and I want him dead." And he sealed it and gave it to Marco, who started out for the castle. So cute. What do you think's going to happen? You think the queen's going to kill him? I think good luck's going to happen. Marco was so full of confidence, yes, but in spite of that, he lost his way going through the forest. And after wandering about till it was nighttime, he lay down at last under a tree and went to sleep. Oh, what do you think's going to happen? Look at these guys. What are they doing? Let's see. Then came along 4 bandit brothers. By the glow of a swaying lantern, who thought there must be money in Marco's pouch, they sneaked it off without waking him up. But the only thing they found inside was the king's letter, which of course they proceeded to read. "Come," said the oldest brother, "we can have some fun with this." So they wrote a new letter with new instructions. "Here is the boy I've chosen to marry the princess. Don't wait, have the wedding now." They had a good laugh about it as they tiptoed away. And the next day, Marco, none the wiser, went on to the castle. The queen read the letter and was happy to do what it said, for Marco and the princess had fallen in love at first sight. Beautiful wedding. So the two were married with plenty of joy and noise. And that should have been the end of it. But it wasn't. Oh, man. King is not very happy. What do you think he's going to do? Once again, it was lucky that Marco was so full of confidence, because he was going to need it now more than ever. The king came home in the middle of things, and when he saw what had happened, he was furious. But all at once, he had an idea. "Before you can settle in with my daughter," he said to Marco, "you'll have to go down to hell and bring me 3 golden hairs from the devil's head." And he grinned, because he was sure the devil would never let Marco come back. But Marco said, "I can do that." And he kissed the princess goodbye and started on his journey. Hopefully you didn't hear my rooster. It was a long, long way, but Marco kept at it till at last he saw far in the distance the river that flows round the rim of hell. And another hour brought him to its very banks, where he found a ferryman with a boat. "Can you take me across?" he asked. "I'll take you," said the ferryman, "but not till you tell me how I can stop this endless backing and forcing. It's boring me to death." "I'll find the answer," said Marco, "and I promise I'll report it when I've finished with what I have to do." So the ferryman, having no choice to put his trust in this tall, sweet, confident boy, took him into the boat and pulled him across the river. Oh, what a scene of gloom and ruin hell turned out to be. It was easy to see why no one was anxious to go there. Marco went down anyway and soon arrived at a hall where an old woman sat by a fire. He asked for the devil, but she shook her head. "He's out, thank goodness," she said, "or he'd snap your nose off. I should know. I'm his grandmother." There's his grandma. Then Marco told her what he needed, but she said he wouldn't like losing any golden hairs. There aren't that many left from the old days in heaven. "But I have to have 3, said Marco, "or else I'll lose the princess." "Dear me," she said, "we can't let that happen. I'll see what I can do." And he added, "One thing more, the ferryman wants to know how to stop being the ferryman." "I'll find a way to ask," she said, "but you stay out of sight." And she worked a spell to make him so tiny he could have hidden in a shoe. At supper time, the devil came home, and right away he sniffled and made a face. "There's a man somewhere hereabout," he said. "I can smell him." "What rubbish," said his grandmother. "There's no one here. Sit down and eat." So the devil did as he was told, and afterwards stretched out with his head in his grandmother's lap. Oh, can go night-night on his grandma. The devil has a grandma. Then when he dozed off, she found the golden hairs and yanked them out. "Ouch!" he cried. "Ouch!" "I'm sorry," she said. "I went to sleep myself and dreamed I pulled the ferryman's hair. He was nagging me to do his job for him." "That was a silly dream," said the devil. "All he had to do was put the pole in your hand, then it would stick to you, you see, so you'd have to take over his job, like it or not." "Well, well," she said, "imagine such a thing." The devil went back to sleep after that and slept all night with no more rude disturbances. In the morning, when he'd once again gone off to tend the business, his grandmother changed Marco back to normal size and gave him the 3 golden hairs. And she told him the secret of the ferryman's job. Then, for good measure, she gave him a chest of coins and jewels. "Here is a present for the princess," she said to Marco. "May I never see the 2 of you in hell." Marco thanked her for this, and for all she had done to help him, and she sent him on his way. At the river, the ferryman was waiting. "Good news," said Marco. "To get rid of this job, just hand the pole to someone else." "As easy as that," said the ferryman. "Here, then, you take it." "Oh, no, not me," said Marco with a laugh. "Then whoever comes next will have a new life's work," said the ferryman. "I'll see to that." So they went back across the river, where Marco untied his donkey and hurried away to the castle. "Well, my sweet," he said to the princess, "see what I have for you." And he opened the chest of coins and jewels. "Oh, and by the way," he said to the king, "here are the golden hairs you wanted." Uh-oh. But the king ignored the hairs. "Where did you get that treasure?" he demanded. "Why," said Marco, "a ferryman took me across the river, and there it was on the other side." "Oh," said the king, "maybe there's more just sitting there." "Maybe," said Marco. "Why don't you go and see?" So the king dashed off towards hell, and he never came back. Wonder what happened. Marco took over the job of being king, and he and the princess lived happily ever after. In fact, everyone was happy. Almost. Who do you think's not happy? For the king. A king no more now had the job of taking people back and forth across the river that flows round the rim of hell with no idea of knowing how to stop. I don't know. I like it. It's funny. Revenge. This is Tuck Everlasting. This is probably one of her most popular books. I don't know if I said that. Yeah, one of her most popular books is this one. There's a movie that I actually really like, and there's a musical production, like a musical. This is a good book. This story is about like a young girl. She's in a wealthy family, and she goes venturing off into the forest, and she finds a boy, Tuck, and his whole family and him are forever stuck in the age at which they drank the water from this pond. And the little girl, man, I don't remember what her name, Winnie, she's kind of given a choice to live with him forever, all eternity at her young age. Just drink the water. But in the end, she doesn't. He watches her grow old, and she dies. But him and his family are always young. including the baby. I think there's a baby, if I remember correctly. It's a good book, and it's a good movie, and it's a good play. I'm sure I haven't seen it. Another good book is this one, Bub, or The Very Best Thing. The king thinks reading and books are the most important thing. And the mom thinks that, doting on her child and giving her child affection is very good. And they have an argument, and so they both go on their journey. And so the queen takes the prince around, looking at things, talking to people, and everyone kind of has their own idea of what's good, what's the very best thing, They hadn't gone very far before they found the day and night nursemaids. "Well now," said the queen, "since we've met like this, I don't suppose you know what the best thing is for his highness, the prince." "Vegetables," said the day nursemaid. "And plenty of sleep," said the night nursemaid. "Vegetables and sleep," said the queen. "Absolutely," said the day nursemaid, "unless you don't want him to be strong." "Of course I do," said the queen, "but neither of those could be the one and only very best thing." The gardener says sun, or sunshine. The court musician says a song. They meet like some lords and ladies, and they say to talk to him and listen to him. Eventually they come to like the cook's daughter, and she goes, "Well, why don't you ask him?" So she whispers to the prince, and he whispers back, "Bub," or so they think. But at the very end, the king and queen are like, "Whatever, we love him, And then at the very, very end, the cook's daughter said to the cook, "The prince was right, Mama. Love is the very best thing." So Bub is just this little prince's way of saying love. It's really cute. I really like it. I will write up, though, about all of her works, and hopefully this is a good presentation.